Section 2.3. Forming molecules and their functions depend on chemical bonds being formed. So why do atoms form bonds? Well, it's simple really. They want to make sure that their outermost shell or their valence is full. Covalent and ionic bonds are the strongest chemical bonds. Electronegativity is the attraction of an atom for the shared electron of a covalent bond. A strong electronegative atom attempts to pull shared electrons toward themselves. If the electron in the covalent bonds are shared equally, this is considered a nonpolar covalent bond. Covalent bonds between atoms of the same element are always nonpolar. For example, oxygen bonded to itself to form an O2 molecule. Those are always nonpolar covalent bonds. Covalent bonds between atoms with similar electronegativity are also considered nonpolar. For example, methane, or CH4. If two atoms differ in their electronegativity, they don't share those electrons equally, and this forms a polar covalent bond. The bonds between oxygen, hydrogen, and water are polar covalent. Oxygen has a much higher electronegativity than hydrogen does. So what we end up with is an area within the molecule of negative polarity and positive, much like a magnet. And this is going to be important in the next chapter when we talk about how do water molecules align themselves to give water its special capabilities. And so these hydrogen bonds form between the positives and the negatives, just like with a magnet. So remember, if we're talking about polar substances dissolve other polar substances. Like dissolves like. Ionics are when two atoms that are so unequal in their attraction for the valence electrons that one atom strips the electron completely from the other atom. After that transfer, both atoms are no longer neutral, but they have a charge called an ion. We talked about those cations and anions. So atoms go through bonding and form ions. So for example, a sodium and a chlorine are both very reactive. They are neutral. They bond to form a salt crystal, and then when we put that salt crystal in water, those ions dissociate in water, and so you're left with sodium ions and chlorine ions. Now those ions have charges, but they are no longer reactive. The strength of an ionic bond depends on the environment. For example, if there's moisture, it's going to affect how strong that bond is. Water can dissolve salts by reducing that attraction between the cations and anions. Weak chemical bonds play important roles in the chemistry of life. Weak interactions, such as ionic bonds that are weak in water, hydrogen bonds, and van der Waals interactions. Hydrogen bonds form when a hydrogen atom is already covalently bonded to a strongly electronegative atom and is still attracted to another strongly electronegative atom. So think about those hydrogen atoms when they form that water molecule. They're still attracted to the other oxygens. So they're kind of the unfaithful atom in the group. A van der Waals interaction is in a nonpolar covalent bond. We have temporary, very, very brief regions of partial positive-negative charge due to the constant motion of electrons. They're moving so fast that occasionally there's going to be a gap, and that creates that nonpolar region becoming polar. Molecules that are in the area or in close proximity can be drawn to those brief changes and differences. And if you remember back to biology, we talked about structure and function. Structure determines function. A molecule's shape determines its function. So the three-dimensional shape of a molecule with two atoms is always linear. But when you get three or more atoms, they can start having more complex shapes. Those shapes are determined by the position of the orbitals that are shared with the other atoms in the bond. So we go back to these weak interactions, the hydrogen bonds, sulfur bonds, van der Waals interactions. All of those can influence the shape and structure of a molecule, which then determines its function. Finally, we're going to squeeze 2.4 in here together because it's very short. 2.4, chemical reactions. They make and break bonds. In a chemical reaction, bonds are broken and reformed, which leads to new arrangements. So our reactants are those starting molecules, and the products are the final molecules. As always, matter is going to be conserved. Chemical reactions don't make or destroy matter, they just rearrange it. So going back to the you are what you eat, all of the atoms that are already built into compounds and molecules that you eat get broken down in your body and rearranged into new structures. So you literally are what you eat. An important chemical reaction is photosynthesis and cellular respiration. We talked about that sophomore year in biology. Without photosynthesis and cellular respiration, we wouldn't be able to survive here on Earth. There are some chemical reactions that continue to completion, where all reactants are converted to products. Most chemical reactions in nature, though, are reversible, so those products become reactants. And then they react again and they become products. And back and forth, back and forth. So eventually equilibrium is going to be met, where the products and reactants are continually being formed. So to sum up this chapter, we're exploring all the chemicals of life, the ordering of atoms into molecules, and the interactions of molecules in shaping and affecting living things. Living things are made up of about 25 chemical elements. Atoms are the smallest particle of an element, and atoms of each element are made of a characteristic number of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Arrangement of those electrons determine the chemical properties of an atom, how it will bond to other atoms. Sometimes atoms gain and lose electrons and form ionic bonds. Sometimes atoms share electrons, forming covalent bonds, making a molecule. Atoms of different elements combine in specific arrangements and ratios to form compounds. Those compounds are what we're going to study for the rest of this unit.